August 1990. Washington's summer peace dissolves in crisis. In just 4 days, the U.S., while calling its action defensive, leads the world toward a major war. The crisis seems unpredictable and unavoidable, but in fact there has been every warning. The Iran-Iraq War, it rages for 8 years. Saddam Hussein takes 500,000 casualties, a warning of his fanaticism. He's left with a 1 million-man army and a ruined economy, a clear warning of trouble. Now, again, oil is to fuel world passions. Though Iraq has the second largest reserves, the Gulf states keep prices low. With the U.S. fleet protecting Kuwaiti tankers, Saddam suspects a conspiracy. He sees no need for the U.S. presence. The Cold War is over. Saddam senses a vacuum. He begins to probe, pressing old border claims against Kuwait. The U.S. isn't too alarmed. Saddam's border grievances are well understood, even conceded. The CIA's director at the time, William Webster,
he clearly wanted control of the oil fields that he felt were his, or where the oil was being stolen, in his view, by slant drilling from Kuwaitis in a disputed border area. He wanted access to the ocean through the islands that he claimed. If he had taken those, he could take those very quickly.
Parallel, the U.S. military gears for a major desert war, an exercise George Bush sees. It's a revised blueprint for a superpower war in the Middle East, and by summer 1990, the Pentagon has it in mind to contain Iraq. Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz reveals this.
We didn't think it was going to come that soon, but in a certain sense, our minds were already somewhat prepared for it. So when he first issued these very blatant threats, we thought something serious was happening.
The threats build. Only 2 months before his invasion, Saddam hosts the Arab League. He castigates the assembled heads of state, accusing them of economic sabotage. He makes huge demands. He had fought Iran for all of them, he says. Now, he wants immediate rewards on border territory, on the price of oil, on war compensation. He wants blood money. Now.
He already taken over $60 billion from the Gulf countries during the Iran-Iraq war. And they were helping him a lot.
It seemed as if it was a minefield, and people had to be wary of where they stepped. I think that, for example, Kuwait provoked Iraq quite a bit prior to the invasion itself.
Mid-July, on the very same day as Saddam's message, U.S. satellite intelligence reveals a massive deployment of Iraqi troops near the Kuwait border. The CIA monitors this.
We could see the gathering of armor on the ground, the movement of military units into attack formation. One time there were 35,000 troops massed on the border. Then there were 70,000.
Then 100,000. It's a very open threat, building day by day for a full 2 weeks. Officially, the U.S. stays silent. No countermove, no caution.
Magnitude of this test.
Again, the Pentagon prepares, summoning Area Commander General Schwarzkopf to review U.S. options. But the Bush administration has been close to Saddam, and now the Arabs are saying not to worry. Egypt's President Mubarak is directly reassured by Saddam.
I decided to go immediately to meet with Saddam Hussein. Then I asked him a direct question. What about the news that there are concentration of Iraqi forces on the Kuwaiti border? Is this right? And then he told me, oh, my friend, there's no problem there. I was very frank with the Emir. You have to give concessions They may need some billions of the euros to take. So you have to find a solution for that.
But Kuwait holds out. 1 week before Saddam invades, he abruptly summons U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie, who tells him the U.S. holds no opinion about your border disagreement with Kuwait. She then goes on vacation. 2 days later, Saddam hears from Secretary of State James Baker, a polite note urging better relations. Yet the Pentagon is now very alarmed. Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz discloses the warning he gave.
There's so much force there, and it's so far committed that there's a significant likelihood he's going to use it.
The military dilemma. Only Saudi Arabia can provide the land base for an effective counterstrike. They approach the Saudi ambassador, Prince Bandar, but he's unconvinced.
And there was a sense that maybe the Americans are a little bit exaggerating it, so that they will then be asked to come in or establish, quote-unquote, presence in the region.
The dilemma for Bush. Saudi cooperation is likely only if Saddam occupies Kuwait. As if sure of U.S. reaction, the Kuwaitis seem strangely unconcerned.
The Kuwaitis still had the same position, that no, let's not exaggerate this.
The invasion eve, Saddam visits the front. For 2 weeks he has hesitated. How far to go? From Washington, silence. Even after the CIA director warns of imminent invasion.
We did so several hours before the invasion occurred and predicted it within 12 to 24 hours.
The warning is routed by National Security Council member Richard Haas to his chief, advisor Brent Scowcroft, dramatically.
And he said, well, let's go see the president about it. And while the three of us were talking, the phone rang. We had just heard from our embassy in Kuwait that shots were being heard and some kind of war had just begun.
Some kind of war, but what exactly? The Bush administration has given huge credits to Iraq. It has stood aside on the border issue. Now its biggest military client is out of control.
We didn't know whether you just had some isolated shooting, whether you had the Iraqis maybe moving a couple of meters into Kuwait. We had no idea of the extent of what was going on.
There was no way of knowing how far Saddam Hussein would go.
Hours into the invasion, Saddam calls Jordan's King Hussein, requesting an Arab summit within 48 hours, saying,
We have gone in, but this is temporary. And we are willing to withdraw, provided we can resolve this problem once and for all within the Arab context.
The day of the invasion, Saddam Hussein tried to phone me several times. I was very upset and shocked about what happened.
King Hussein, hurrying to Cairo, finds Mubarak furious with Saddam.
I didn't answer the phone at all.
Mubarak feels betrayed and feels Saddam has also duped the king.
The king stayed with me 6 hours. I didn't hear him saying a complete sentence which you couldn't understand anything. Then George Bush phoned us. I told him, give us 24 hours or 48 hours. We may find a good solution.
So the feeling was, okay, we'll give people their 48 hours. Quite honestly, there wasn't a lot we could do yet. You can't suddenly start up the American military machine as though you're flicking on a light switch.
For a few crucial hours, both Bush and Saddam seem to wait on each other. Saddam is still not warned. Bush makes his first statement on the crisis, saying he won't discuss military options, but is not contemplating any. Saddam's forces, never seriously warned off, occupy Kuwait City and systematically sack it. By this act, Saddam defies and mocks the major powers who have aided and armed him. Now he's helped by pro-Saddam upheaval in Arab capitals. It spurs Arab leaders.
So many people are phoning my office. What's that? What are we going to do? What's our position in such a bad situation? Really, I was in a mess from the people themselves.
Mubarak also cannot forgive Saddam's betrayal.
He invaded the country. There was no reason. He bluffed me, so I cannot support him if he gives me 100 billion.
Day 2, Bush summons his inner circle. A small group, they avoid dissent.
I think everybody had a sense that we were wrestling with a absolutely extraordinary crisis, one of the major events of the decade.
He did not ask for policy recommendations. He asked very searching questions, and in the end, he made his own judgments.
With Kuwait's emir safe in Saudi Arabia, the urgency is Saudi oil, 20% of world reserves. In checking Saddam, Kuwait is a sacrificial pawn, its ambassador admits.
If you go into Saudi Arabia, I think the whole focus would have been on Saudi Arabia rather than on Kuwait, and Kuwait would have been like a bargaining chip in the whole thing. And I was praying that night that he would stop there in Kuwait.
We lacked the means to help Kuwait, even if the will were there. We had to have a place to put our troops, and until Saudi Arabia was involved, we did not have that capability.
The American side was saying, ask us for help, then we'll tell you what we will do.
Prince Bandar becomes the key intermediary with Saudi King Fahd. The U.S. wants to send a deterrent force immediately, but Fahd has two major concerns. There's the huge social risk of having foreign troops in the Holy Land. And there's the risk of U.S. staying power, American resolve. There comes an extraordinary moment when Bush tells Bandar,
I give you my word that if you ask for help, and we will come to help you as good friends, and I will go with you all the way.
All the way. The President of the United States has given his word of honor. In private. Publicly, nothing has been said. The Pentagon chiefs hasten to Riyadh, persuading King Fahd that Saddam is about to invade. Agreement comes in a mere 100 words. Prince Bandar is there.
A simple agreement, however, with the Americans, that American lawyers did not like very much, simply because it was half-a-page agreement.
It has 3 conditions. Friendly forces would be invited. They would leave whenever Saudi Arabia requested. They would respect Saudi traditions.
3 lines, we signed it, and every country that sent troops to Saudi Arabia had to sign the same agreement.
Those in favor of the draft resolution.
At the United Nations, the emphasis is on sanctions. The UN approves a naval blockade of Iraq, but at the White House, Bush orders carte blanche for any troop needs. John Sununu, then Chief of Staff, on the hidden agenda.
It eventually got to be more than 250,000, but that's just that sequence of their response to the president saying, make sure that if we are going to do this, we do this absolutely right.
Though the scenario is open-ended, Bush only announces a defensive force of 10,000 troops. Within days, warships from Canada, Australia, and Europe prepare for the Gulf. Despite different agendas, it's an extraordinary expression of international will. Saddam dismisses it. With 350,000 troops in Kuwait, Saddam could seize Saudi Arabia, could effectively control the Western economies. Oil dependency speeds the coming war. Cairo. After days of hesitation, 12 nations of the Arab League commit troops to defend Saudi Arabia. Bush's Rolodex diplomacy has prevailed. He now has his coalition and a new crisis. Saddam calls them guests, 13,000 foreign hostages, including women and children. The drama instantly enlarges, becoming a kind of surreal television serial.
Does Stuart get his milk?
If there was one incident which I think in British terms consolidated the whole of British public opinion in their support It was the occasion when Saddam Hussein was seen with a young British boy, patronizing him in the most disgusting way.
Though the anti-war movement is set back by the hostage affair, much of the Western public still supports sanctions, not force. No blood for oil. In avoiding that imagery, President Bush has trouble defining the Gulf mission. To contain public unease, the dimensions are not spelled out. Initially, the U.S. considers acting without UN authority, reveals Pentagon strategist Paul Wolfowitz.
We were doing some unilateral contingency planning, and I think we would have acted with that minimum coalition, which would be Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kuwait, obviously, some of our key allies, presumably, I think, Canada.
It certainly wouldn't hurt at all.
It forces quick choices. In Canada, as elsewhere, Parliament is on vacation. Prime Minister Mulroney rejects recalling it. Like the Europeans and Soviets, his priority is quick UN management of the Gulf crisis. UN Ambassador Yves Fortier.
He saw this as an opportunity for the framers of the UN Charter to see their dreams realized. And he wanted Canada to exercise leadership in that area.
If Saddam doesn't withdraw, the UN can go further, says Mulroney.
We won't hesitate to take remedial action.
Mulroney is now asked for more. Sanctions are just 5 weeks old when he commits a fighter squadron to the Gulf, a force that builds to 2,200 personnel and a desert base called Canada Dry. Overall Commander General de Chastelan.
And this was a very incremental war. We started out going to think we were going to monitor sanctions, then we found we were going to enforce sanctions, and then we found that we might be involved in an actual war, not just defending ourselves, but attacking.
Now, a measure of the stakes. 50 warships from a dozen Atlantic nations blockade the Gulf. The Canadians, with 3 frigates, take on the major task of coordinating the search of all Iraqi traffic. Every boarding brings risk of a firefight, a missile attack, a total showdown. Week by week, the blockade tightens, but the military momentum cannot wait on sanctions. In human terms, the oil squeeze is already tragic as Third World workers driven out of Kuwait and Iraq besiege neighboring Jordan, desperate for shelter and food. Jordan's Queen Noor.
We had been caught up in a game of nations. Over 800,000 evacuees, as we called them, who poured into our borders, camped out in the desert and in makeshift shelters, many with nothing at all.
American-born Queen Noor, an urban planner before she marries King Hussein, helps supervise the camps. Their economy wrecked, Jordan's king and queen, once close friends of George Bush, find themselves outcasts.
That attitude came into play very quickly. If you're not with us, you're against us, and there's no middle ground.
The test of wills escalates. Saddam repeatedly visits his hostages, drawing out the television drama of the guests he now calls human shields, most of them Europeans and Americans. The leadership language becomes extreme. Author Christine Helms has met Saddam.
Being called demon or being called Hitler by Bush, I think, told Saddam just one thing that was very important to him, and that was it gave him the flavor, the tenor of what was going to happen. And I believe that probably hardened his decisions.
Though Saddam releases the women and children, the Gulf is now something more.
It's not just a gap, it's a widening abyss on a day-to-day basis.
One by one, Western embassies in Kuwait are starved into closing. It persuades France to dispatch troops, and the U.S. sends another 100,000. By Thanksgiving, Bush inspects a desert force that has grown in just 3 months from 10,000 to 230,000 troops. Bush, in his mind, is resolved.
Until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
Kuwait's emir calls on the U.S. president, bringing a gift of a clock etched with the map of Kuwait. The emir points to the map, saying, "This is what I want."
The president turned around to him in a very strong, expressive way. He said, "That's what you're going to get."
The day before the U.S. relinquishes the chair, the UN Security Council approves a resolution co-sponsored by Canada. It authorizes the use of all necessary means should Iraq not withdraw from Kuwait within 6 weeks, by January the 15th. With the fear of war comes a deeper fear. What kind of war it might be. Privately, the coalition leaders anticipate a very bloody war. The military dynamics take over. At Christmas, the two chief protagonists send messages to the world, never mentioning peace. In Baghdad, as a new year begins, war seems insupportable, yet only 2 weeks to the deadline. 2 men must decide. Visiting Kuwait, Saddam makes a traditional good luck offering of salt, while in 1,000 small towns across America, yellow ribbons number the lives to be committed. Only 2 weeks before their president must decide.
Those of us who saw him every day could see that he was thinking about this now almost constantly.
But I'm convinced that he did what he did out of conviction that it was right, because he took a very large risk.
And I think he understood the risks. I think he understood that his whole reputation in history, maybe his office, if he failed in this, he could face impeachment. Not to mention the risks of having a military disaster around your neck.
6 days to go. One moment of hope remains. In Geneva, the Americans and Iraqis finally meet face to face. A letter from Bush to Saddam is delivered, but left unaccepted. Richard Haas drafts the letter.
It was largely a message of firmness, which is you had better contemplate the abyss into which you were about to plunge you and your nation.
At the last moment, Congress ratifies the use of force. But January 14th, eve of the UN ultimatum, Iraq's National Assembly votes unanimously against withdrawal from Kuwait. The deputies chant, "Long live Saddam." In an underground bunker, Saddam briefs his high command. A closed circle, cousins, old cronies. Saddam talks, they listen. The war will be limited. Iraq, he says, will survive. Inshallah. It is God's will, he tells them. In Washington, Bush's inner cabinet convenes, a dozen advisors he's leaned on throughout. Their conclusion is not so different to Saddam's. The task is to free Kuwait, but not destabilize Iraq. Bush, too, makes his decision. His chief of staff.
It was a pretty much the die was cast kind of a conclusion that morning.
January the 15th, when it came, I think we were breathless. I mean, waiting for this time to come.
The UN deadline is to expire at midnight. In the distant desert wadis, 1 million soldiers wait. This is the global village in the late 20th century. Everywhere, a silence. War, no other way. Inshallah. For almost 6 months, Saddam Hussein has occupied Kuwait, claiming it as part of Iraq from pre-colonial days. Now, January 15th, the very day of the UN deadline for Iraq's withdrawal, he visits his frontline troops. In the long build-up of armor and emotions, only hours remain.
And I tried with Saddam Hussein sincerely, not for the propaganda. 32 times messages, written, oral, through the media, through the television, asking, please.
32 appeals from one head of state to another, unanswered. And now the eve of war, the last prayer. Jordan's King Hussein is concerned.
I was concerned for the human losses, for the blood that would flow, for the bones that would be broken, for the relations that would leave this region in tatters.
A new age of war, high-tech war, begins, each side with its concept of victory.
Operation Desert Storm forces were engaging targets in Kuwait and Iraq.
It is war on schedule. It begins with the air war, the scale of it unprecedented. President Bush has set the objective unequivocally. Commander of the air war, General Charles Horner, on his orders.
We have to bring the force to bear, then bring it to bear in such a way and of such magnitude that it is over with quickly.
Smart weapons originally designed to combat the Soviets render the outcome inevitable. It is only a question of losses. The British field commander, Sir Peter de la Billière, on the preparations.
You set this great machine up, spent 6 months working at it, and then you suddenly lifted the starting gate and it's off. If there'd been heavy losses, then we would know that we'd perhaps not gained the initiative.
The initial moments of the war are very difficult for all of us. There's a feeling of just despair, because you're going to embark on taking of lives, and you're going to lose lives of friends, of colleagues, of allies. And so that is a real bummer, the best way to put it.
Rather like an election campaign, you wait for the first few seats to come in to get a feel for how the campaign's going to unfold. So that next morning was critical. How many of these aircraft were going to come home?
It's not that we didn't have confidence, but there was just that element of doubt that had been nurtured by all the negative press, by all the self-doubt that all of us have. I'll tell you, it was tough, those opening moments.
To a watching world, it looks apocalyptic. The spectacle seems sufficient for Saddam. He grounds his air force. The fireworks fit the mood of the coalition commanders.
A sort of almost festive feeling as you saw that there were losses were exceedingly light, indeed so light as to be almost beyond one's wildest hopes.
From the start, the war is heavily censored on both sides. 1,200 Western reporters rely almost entirely on military briefings. The most televised event in history relays little but spectacle. A longtime Middle East correspondent, Robert Fisk.
For many of them, it was the first time they'd ever covered a war. They thought it was about victory and excitement and our side winning.
It's seen as a kind of user-friendly war. Even in Moscow, once the intended recipient of it all.
The war was basically viewed by most people as fun and kind of exciting, because the way it was shown, the way the military allowed it to be shown. The smart bombs going into holes this big, so that people were saying, they were just saying, amazed at, look at this technology.
Oh, yes!
Day 2. The euphoria gives way to dread and disbelief as a third world nation unleashes its Scud missiles. Early press reports that these first Scuds may carry chemical warheads cause panic in Israel. U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz.
The Israelis came over on the hotline and said they were getting ready to take military action to respond. And we said, wait, we need to talk about it some more.
It is the crisis the U.S. fears most. That Israel will enter the war and split the Arab coalition. Egypt's Hosni Mubarak.
I phoned Mr. Shamir at that time. Told him, be patient. It's better to keep quiet. This give a good impression, at least, to the Muslim world. And thank God that Shamir was reasonable at that time.
Shamir is also warned that Israel might get caught in the crossfire, would get no special protection if entering the war, reveals Paul Wolfowitz.
We did not agree to get out of their way if they did go in. We were flying so intensively over western Iraq that if the Israelis had gone in without coordination with us, in effect without our acquiescence, the danger of some misunderstanding was quite high. And we had that leverage, and they knew it.
Day to day, the psychological war continues. At any time, if Saddam uses chemical weapons, what then? And would air war be decisive, or would it rally the Iraqis behind Saddam? With each day, Saddam can portray surviving as winning, at whatever cost. And the cost is to mount.
This is the headquarters of the Air Force. Keep your eye on all sides of the building as the airplane overflies the building.
Precision bombing, says the military. The British commander.
I was amazed when I saw how accurate the American bombing became. You just virtually put a cross on the bridge and where you want the bomb to go, and that's where it goes, within a few feet.
This is the Air Defense Headquarters in the vicinity of Baghdad.
Pinpoint accuracy, the military claims. But smart bombs comprise only 7% of the tonnage dropped. In accepting news management, the media become the war's losers, says journalist Robert Fisk.
They broke the trust. They became a conduit down which the military could blow and the message would whiz out the other end to the reader or the viewer. They became, in effect, unpaid propagandists.
I think the thing that we all learned from Vietnam is that you have to be very careful with the media. Not careful in terms of trying to manipulate them, but careful in what you give them, because they will try and make a story.
Confounding this policy, live coverage from Baghdad, a factory producing baby formula, or biological weapons. Both sides show only what serves their propaganda. By the third week of air war, the targets are dual use: highways, bridges, power, water, sewage plants, everyday life. It's an intelligence decision. CIA Director William Webster.
Judgments had to be made in those areas. That's the nature of war. Bridges were destroyed. Other things were not destroyed on purpose.
Selection of targets in this war was very, very carefully done. That doesn't mean that occasionally bombs didn't miss. War is not antiseptic, but we attempted to do whatever we could.
2 days later, climaxing a month in which stealth bombers attacked Baghdad 1,200 times, a shelter is hit, killing 288 civilians, mostly women and children. The coalition says civilians were put in harm's way. General Horner.
It was not a mistake. The bunker itself had the potential to be a secondary command and control agency, and certainly that capability was there.
I don't think anybody who went there felt that they believed the story that it was an important military target.
The day before, the BBC's John Simpson films a girls' school adjoining the shelter.
I think the chances that some, or maybe even most of those girls were in the shelter when the bomb hit are pretty strong. And that seems to me to have been a crime as equal to the things that Saddam was doing.
This thing must stop. We are no better than Saddam Hussein with what we're doing in the Middle East today.
Anti-war protests erupt globally, then give way in coalition nations like Canada to support for the forces overseas. In France, the defense minister resigns, saying the war exceeds the objectives of the United Nations. Saddam reemerges, a man at ease among destruction. He has chosen war but does not fight. He has sent his air force into hiding in Iran. He holds back much of his army to keep in power. And still he rationalizes that the coalition fears him, fears a ground war.
If he could give the coalition, and particularly the Americans, a bloody nose on the ground, then he would have had a major political victory in the eyes of the Middle East.
Iraqi forces penetrate Saudi Arabia, capturing the town of Khafji and world headlines. The coalition claims quick victory, but eyewitness Robert Fisk finds it isn't true.
Leading Allied statesmen were saying the town had effectively been retaken. And I got in outside the pool, and the fighting was still going on. What had been put out was totally untrue.
In this first ground combat, 14 U.S. Marines are killed, 7 by their own side. Saddam needlessly sacrificed his troops, says General Horner.
He didn't care whether he lost his entire army as long as he inflicted 5, 10, 15, 20,000 casualties on our troops. Then he could declare victory and go home.
In the desert, the Pentagon chiefs and Schwarzkopf confer. There's concern that the prolonged air war is yielding diminishing returns, that it might even help Saddam find support for a settlement. They begin probes for a ground war, but they worry, has Saddam been saving his chemical warheads for this? William Webster, CIA.
He did have about 35 of them loaded with chemical weapons. He did not use them, but we thought he would use them.
The chemical warhead has to be popped at the right altitude in order to get max dispersion, and it needs a very, very sophisticated fuse, and I just don't think he had it.
I would say that he was concerned that it was going to escalate the whole war up to a level that really would not have been acceptable even to Saddam Hussein. And
one other explanation that many think influenced him, the president had issued a kind of warning that all bets might be off if he used any of these things, and he knew we had nuclear capability, and he feared it.
What kind of war it might be, only 2 men know. And in this much, says a military expert, Bush and Saddam understand each other.
I really think that there was a secret dialogue between Iraq and the coalition powers, and I think that America in particular would have said to them, to Iraq, if you go chemical, we'll go nuclear, and we can limit our nuclear attacks so that it's not going to be devastating to the rest of the region, and really Iraq will cease to exist.
In occupied Kuwait, coalition gunships begin to probe Iraqi defenses. For the Kuwaitis in particular, the enemy is time. Ambassador al-Sabah.
Time was of the essence because the longer the occupation continued, the less will be of Kuwait. The whole identity of the country will be lost.
A measure of the urgency, Canadians get their first combat orders in 40 years. Guided by a full moon, CF-18 Hornets attack an Iraqi gunboat. A small but highly symbolic action. Chief of Defense Staff General John de Chastelain.
We gave a great deal of credence to the cohesion of the coalition. If we, as a nation that is fairly respected in the world, had said we don't think we should get involved in this, it might have made it a little more difficult for other nations to agree.
Readying for a rough war, Canadians complete a forward field hospital to serve their own and British casualties. Conditions here have a harsh reality. The momentum gathers. Surrender leaflets shower with the bombs on Iraqi troops in Kuwait. Finally, Saddam tries 11th hour Soviet and French mediation. On Valentine's Day, Saddam proposes a phased Iraqi withdrawal linked to talks on Palestine. Moscow's endorsement alarms the coalition. It would leave Saddam too strong. Within hours, Bush rejects the overture, insisting on Iraq's unconditional withdrawal. Even with the Soviet envoy still in Baghdad, bombing continues. Moscow is embarrassed but resigned. Vladimir Pozner.
Had the Soviet Union supported Iraq in this particular instance, that would have meant basically the end of any further development of relationship with Western Europe and with the United States.
Saddam gets an ultimatum: withdraw within 24 hours or face a ground war. Mediation ceases. He is alone. Anticipating the ultimatum, he has issued his orders. A scorched earth retreat. More than 700 wellheads are dynamited. Now Saddam's intentions are unmistakable.
If he cannot have Kuwait, then he will destroy it. And that's exactly what he attempted to do.